Hi, my name is Kristen. This is Kristen Cray's Books. So I figured now is the best time to talk about my favorite nonfiction titles. It is officially Nonfiction November. I've already read one nonfiction book for this month and it makes me so excited because I've been neglecting nonfiction this year. And I feel like so much of what I talk about is fiction, but when I read nonfiction, I always love it. It is very rare for me to give a nonfiction book anything less than 4 stars. So I have a huge stack here, a huge stack that I listen to on audiobook because I do prefer my nonfiction on audio. Even the ones that I own, a lot of them I ended up listening to on audio and then buying the books later because I just love them and wanted them on my shelves. So this is not an extensive list. There are so many more that I could have done, but I had to narrow myself down to 20. So let's get right to it. The first one is one that I came out a few years ago and I finally worked up the courage to read it, and I'm so glad because I think it's probably my favorite memoir. And that is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. Chanel Miller is the victim in the Brock Turner case, the Stanford rapist case, if you're familiar with that. And she's brilliant. I loved her writing so much. I loved how vulnerable she was in here. I think a lot of women will unfortunately relate to her story. And the way that she was re-victimized by the justice system is just so infuriating. But I hope that Chanel Miller continues to write because she really is fantastic at it. And I think it's worth watching videos of her speak as well. So I know that this is a really tough subject for a lot of people, but if you can't handle it, it's definitely worth picking up, and I'm so glad that I finally got to the point where I could read it. Next, I have a couple celebrity memoirs, and I do appreciate a celebrity memoir once in a while, especially on an audiobook. And the first one I have is Me by Elton John. And Rocket Man is one of my top 5 favorite movies. I cannot tell you how many times I've watched Rocket Man. And the audiobook is actually narrated by Taron Egerton, who plays Elton John in the movie Rocket Man, so I love that so much. This gives you even more details of Elton John's life past the movie, because I think the movie ends in the 80s and he really gets into the 90s, and here his relationship with his manager and how his manager was stealing from him. He talks about all his friendships with celebrities, his friendship with Versace, his friendship with Princess Di, and there's some really moving moments in here, some really difficult moments. He talks about his husband and his children, so you just get a huge scope of Elton John's life, which I think is interesting, and I loved the audiobook so much. Then the next one is definitely one you have to listen to on audiobook if you can, and that is Over the Top by Jonathan Van Ness. Jonathan Van Ness is from Queer Eye, and he narrates the audiobook himself, and he's so vulnerable in his memoir. It actually says A Raw Journey to Self-Love. So he starts this off by saying that he's worried that the readers would look at him differently or think of him in a different way, but it actually just made me love him even more. There's a lot about his life that I didn't know, and he shares so much. But then there's also the quintessential Jonathan Van Ness humor, so if you're familiar with him, you will know what I'm talking about. So anybody that loves him, I think, will love this. If you're a fan of the US version of The Office, you have to read The Office, the untold story of the greatest sitcom of the 2000s by Andy Green. A lot of people who worked on the show, either on camera or behind the camera, have tidbits in here. You can hear a lot from Creed, which is interesting. And I learned a lot about the show. It made me appreciate it even more. And then the relationships between everybody that worked on the show, how close they got, a lot of behind the scene information about certain episodes that are popular. The proposal one is really interesting. So I just loved it. It was really like a comforting book for me. It's longer, but I flew through it because I really do love that show so much. And of course you get pictures, and it's really told through interview formats from all the actors and people on the show, just quoting what they said. So I liked it. Oscar's in here a lot, and I loved learning more about Angela and Pam's friendship. Everything about this is fantastic. It is a must-read for fans of the show. I'm such a huge fan of Maggie O'Farrell's fiction writing. Hamnet is one of my favorite books ever, so it's no surprise that I would love her nonfiction. And this is her memoir. It's called I Am. And she tells her story through her 17 brushes with death. And some of them are small, some are more serious, but it's a really interesting way to tell your story, and I was moved by it, especially the last chapter where she's talking about her daughter. It's something that has really stayed with me and is really powerful. So if you're looking for a good memoir, highly recommend I Am, because the writing's beautiful and it's a really compelling story, and it's always nice to learn more about the authors who write some of your favorite fiction. This next one is the one that I started 2021 off with, and you can tell because it's tabbed. I had good resolutions, all these good intentions at the beginning of the year. But this is Capote, a biography by Gerald Clark, and this was actually published in the 80s, and the author formed a sort of friendship with Truman Capote while writing this book. So you get a lot of Truman Capote's feelings, a lot of more behind the scene and background information that I don't think you would have gotten otherwise. And I've always been fascinated by Truman Capote as a person, even more than his work. I do love In Cold Blood, but the sections in here where the author talks about how writing In Cold Blood affected Truman Capote are so fascinating, and that actually was the inspiration of the movie Capote with Philip Seymour Hoffman, which is definitely worth watching as well. But we get into so much more detail in this one, and I want to read more biographies of Capote because he's such a fascinating person to me. His friendships are interesting. The way that he treated the people in his life was interesting, and he had a lot of struggles, but he was such a compelling person. So if you're interested in Capote at all, I do recommend this, though it is massive. How many pages? Well, to be honest, all this is source notes, so really it's 550 pages, but it looks a lot bigger. So I really like this, and there are a few other Capote nonfiction books that are on my list. If you're wanting to learn more about the Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein, I definitely recommend Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow. I will never look at NBC the same way again. The subtitle here is Lies, Spies, and Conspiracy to Protect Predators. So that's really at the heart of what this is. So Ronan Farrow is the person who broke the Harvey Weinstein story, and he really went to many companies. He went to NBC trying to expose Harvey Weinstein, and it was all covered up. Nobody wanted to touch it. So it's really infuriating in that way, and Ronan Farrow talks to a lot of the women that were involved in this and gets their stories. So I love that he gave the women voices in here, and they really trusted him. He really talks about the bonds that he formed with them and how they opened up with him, and he was really respectful of them. So I thought this was fantastic, and I know there's also a podcast. So if you don't want to read the book, I would recommend the podcast as well, because I think it covers a lot of the same topics. This next one is probably the most underrated book on this list. I believe Penguin Canada sent this to me when it first came out, and this is The Victorian and the Romantic, a memoir, a love story, and a friendship across time. And this is by Nell Stevens, and this is so fascinating. Nell Stevens was getting a PhD, I believe, in literature, and she was writing her dissertation on Elizabeth Gaskell. Elizabeth Gaskell is a famous author. She wrote North and South. I'll put a picture up here. Maybe you'll recognize it. It's the same kind of era as Jane Austen. And Nell Stevens is digging into Elizabeth Gaskell's life and realizing the parallels to her own. So she really takes Elizabeth Gaskell's story, and she was kind of moved by the decisions that Elizabeth made in her life and applies it to her own. And I thought it was brilliantly done. I really enjoyed this, and I love to see the connection between these two women, even though they were born generations apart. So I thought that was fun. They've obviously never met. Elizabeth Gaskell has long passed away by the time Nell Stevens is alive, but her connection to her feels very real, and I thought that was beautiful. If you're an introvert like I am, you really have to read Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain, because I think a lot of us can look at our introversion as something that is negative, and this really changed the way I looked at that part of my personality, and I really learned to embrace it and use it to my advantage. And that's really what Susan Cain has set out here for you to do. So there's a lot of research in here. She talks about a lot of studies and just personal examples, and it's really brilliant and life-changing for me, honestly. And I also think if you're an extrovert who has a close connection to an introvert and you don't quite understand them, this is a good one to pick up or to gift to introverts in your life. I think this would make a perfect Christmas present. This collection is one of the best nonfiction I've read this year, and it is Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century, and it's edited by Alice Wong. And I really hope that Alice Wong puts out a volume 2 of this collection, because I thought this was fantastic. So it's a collection of different stories, eulogies, articles from people who have a disability. So they're really deeply personal. Everybody's experience is completely different. They share different aspects of it. Some is joy, some is heartache, some is stereotypes. There's a eulogy, so it's heartbreaking in that way, but ultimately it's moving, it's eye-opening. I think everybody should be reading this, and as I said, I really hope Alice Wong puts out a part 2, because I do think that this was a really well-received collection. Much like with Maggie O'Farrell, I also enjoy this author's fiction so much, and that is Matt Haig, and this is my favorite of his nonfiction, though I still have to read the comfort book. I've heard great things about that one, but this is Notes on a Nervous Planet by Matt Haig, and this is actually one of the first ARCs I ever received, and it was amazing, and I've passed this to so many people. There are passages in here that I think speak to everybody. Everyone will find something that they relate to. So Matt Haig is very open about his struggles with mental health. At one point he was suicidal. He talks about that quite a bit, so he's got a lot of interesting and personal insights into that, and that's really what he's talking about on here. Like, one of the places I've had panic attacks, so he's sharing all the places he's had panic attacks: supermarket, at a nightclub, on an airplane, on the London Underground. So I think they're just little tidbits that people will relate to. So let me see, how to be happy, and what else, 2 lists about work, shaping the future. So it's just little essays that really speak to me. You can tab this. I really want to reread it and tab my favorites and refer back to them when you need this. And he also has Reasons to Stay Alive, which is very similar and definitely worth reading as well. 2 more physical ones. I really have been into food memoirs lately, and this one is by far my favorite. It is Save Me the Plums, my gourmet memoir by Ruth Reichel. And Ruth Reichel was a food editor in New York for a long time, and then she became the editor-in-chief at Gourmet magazine. So she has a lot of insight into the food industry, into what goes on behind the scenes at restaurants, and it is eye-opening. It's brilliant. I loved the personal things about her life as well. She talks about her son and her husband. There is a part where she talks about 9/11 in here, because she was editor-in-chief at Gourmet magazine at that time and making food for all the firefighters and things, and I was moved to tears during that part, and then I just learned a lot. I thought this was fantastic. I know that Ruth Reichel has some other food memoirs that I want to get to because I loved her writing. She's obviously was a food critic for, I think it was at New York Times. So she's obviously a fantastic writer. We know that. She writes about food in a very beautiful way. Highly recommend this one if you are wanting to get into food memoirs. They're so much fun. This last physical book was such a cover buy for me, and this is Fiercely Happy, a funny book about horrible things by Jenny Lawson. And I've since read every Jenny Lawson memoir, but I highly recommend them on audiobook because she narrates them herself and she's hilarious. She really brings her books to life, and you really get the humor even more. So as this is a funny book about horrible things, that sums up all of her memoirs. But this one is my favorite because I think it's the first one of hers that I read, and this cover is hilarious. So Jenny Lawson struggles with mental health. She has chronic illness. I think she has rheumatoid arthritis, so she really delves into a lot of her life and how she's treated and what she feels, and it's just harrowing in some ways. It's heartbreaking in a lot of ways, but it's also hysterical how she talks about it. So I think that makes it more palpable for people, more relatable for a lot of people, and I think it's really important that she tells her story, and the way she does it, I think, reaches people in a different way. So love this one. I also listened to Broken, which just came out this year, and highly recommend that one as well. So now getting on to the ones that I don't own. The first one is Bad Blood. This is by John Carreyrou, and again, there's a podcast of this. So if you are not interested in reading the book, I definitely recommend the podcast. And John Carreyrou broke the Theranos Elizabeth Holmes story. So if you know anything about that, you will love this. It is a wild story. It almost reads like fiction. So Elizabeth Holmes, the case is happening right now. So now's a perfect time to be reading this. And she started a company called Theranos, and it was a medical company. And she was creating a product that was said to be able to diagnose different illnesses, and she really scammed a lot of people. The Obamas are mentioned in here. It was all fake. She had all these employees that she was deceiving. It is just such a wild story. You have to read it. And she's an interesting person in and of herself. So yeah, highly recommend that one. It's always one of the books I recommend for somebody who's looking to get into nonfiction because it's so addicting to listen to. If you are like me and you love science, nature, nonfiction, my absolute favorite is The Invention of Nature, and this is by Andrew Wolfe. And it follows Alexander von Humboldt, who was alive at the same time as Darwin, but doesn't get the recognition that he deserves. So he is going on a journey to discover nature, and he identifies a lot of plants and animals, and very much in the same vein as Darwin. So he's incredible. Some people say that he is really the first environmentalist, so that one is worth reading. I learned so much, and I really kind of fell in love with him as a person. Then we have the book that I find myself recommending the most often, and that is Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Laurie Gottlie. And this is an interesting mix of memoir and really talking about her job, her work. She is a psychologist, a therapist, but she's also going to therapy herself. So she's talking about her own patients and their stories, with their permission, of course, and name changes and details change and that kind of thing. And then her own experience with going to therapy. So I learned a lot from this one. I always recommend it to people who are looking to get into therapy or who are reluctant to get to therapy, because I think there's something comforting in it and relatable about it, and it's just fantastic. It deserves all the hype that it gets. Of course, I have to have another memoir because it's my favorite nonfiction genre, and this one is Heavy by Kiese Laymon. And this title says it all. This is a heavy story. His life has not been easy, but it's really focusing on his relationship with his body and the relationship he has with his mother. And it's heartbreaking in a lot of ways. And he writes about his relationship with his mother in a way that's so vulnerable and honest. And I'm going to link down below because his mom wrote a letter to him in response to the book, and I loved what she had to say. She was so open and accepting of him, even if she didn't view things the same way. She was open to hearing what he had to say. So I think that adds something even more to this story. And another memoir is The Sun Does Shine by Anthony Ray Hinton. And if you are familiar with the Innocence Project or Just Mercy or Bryan Stevenson, Anthony Ray Hinton is one of Bryan Stevenson's clients. He was on death row and he was innocent. So really he is sharing his story of how he was arrested, his time on death row, and then his eventual release. So I loved it. All the guards fell in love with Anthony Ray Hinton. He actually started a book club on death row, so he's just a fantastic guy. It's heartbreaking what he went through, and Bryan Stevenson is just incredible. Honestly, watch the movie Just Mercy. Anthony Ray Hinton is a character in there, just a side character, but it made me excited to see him. And the videos on YouTube of his release, oh, it's terrible. Yeah, but love that book. It's fantastic. I also loved it on audio. Then we have a really interesting one. It's called Furious Hours by Casey Seep, and this is about Harper Lee. And she became really fascinated with a case, much like Truman Capote, who was her friend, did with In Cold Blood, the In Cold Blood case. And she was going to work on writing a nonfiction book about this case, but she never actually did. So this author dives into the case itself, which is interesting, and I think I'm just not going to tell you anything because it's best to go into that not knowing the story. It's not a very popular case, I don't believe. And then also talking about Harper Lee and her time investigating the case. Also really talks about her relationship with Truman Capote. Their dynamic is obviously compelling to me, so that one's worth reading as well. This last one is one that so many people talk about, and for a good reason, and that is The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. And this is a heartbreaking story, but I loved that these women stood up for themselves at the time, and that Kate Moore gives them voices now all these years later. So we're following women who work at a watch company. They are making watches, and they're painting the dials of the watches with radium. And at this time, radium was huge, but people at the company, people were trying to figure out that radium was harmful, but did nothing to protect these women. These women were licking paintbrushes to get the tip of the paintbrush perfect, and then dipping it in radium, licking it again. So they were getting seriously ill. People's jaws were falling off. It was horrible to read about. And the way that they were treated and not protected is just disgusting. But Kate Moore told their story in such a great way. I know she has another book out. I'm going to put the cover here. And I keep meaning to read it. It just came out this summer, I believe. So she's fantastic. This one deserves all the hype. And I think that there's a movie out. So that is it. I'm losing my voice. That was a lot of books, and I could have gone on and on. So please let me know what your favorite nonfiction book is. If you've read any of these, if they're on your TBR, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.